Venezuela sends warships with oil cargo, turning economic pressure into a high-risk maritime standoff. The decisive moment arrives not with a speech or a sanction list, but with Venezuelan naval vessels physically escorting oil cargo into open waters. A move that immediately reframes what happened from abstract pressure into a concrete line crossed at sea. And this reaction, in my opinion, signals that the balance has shifted from managed escalation to direct challenge, which is why this analysis begins here, at the point where restraint gives way to calculated defiance and consequences start to matter. What happened next is not simply a recap of tankers moving toward Asia, but a reaction to the seizure of a vessel and the announcement of a partial blockade that was meant to intimidate rather than collide. Yet by choosing escorts, President Nicolas Maduro transforms economic leverage into a test of will, forcing Washington to confront the reality that pressure now meets presence rather than compliance. The intensity of this moment lies in the fact that the ships involved were not on the sanctioned list, carrying petroleum-related products such as urea and petroleum coke, which sends a deliberate message that Venezuela is operating inside a narrow legal space, while daring the United States to decide whether it will expand enforcement beyond its stated limits. From a psychological perspective, this is where months of accumulated restraint begin to crack, because despite sustained pressure and maritime actions that legal experts have questioned, Caracas had largely avoided force, and the sudden pivot to naval escorts suggests a leadership calculating that inaction now carries greater risk than confrontation later. The blockade threat was designed to choke oil exports, the backbone of Venezuela's economy, and by escorting ships outward rather than shielding ports inward, the government reframes the narrative from defense to assertion, signaling that survival now depends on keeping trade moving, even under threat. In my opinion, the most revealing element is not the movement of the vessels themselves, but the confusion inside Washington, where officials reportedly scrambled to determine who would actually enforce the blockade, exposing a gap between presidential language and operational clarity that weakens deterrence at precisely the wrong time. The uncertainty over whether the military, the Coast Guard, or other law enforcement agencies would take the lead shows how quickly economic pressure can outpace institutional preparedness, turning a policy tool into a risk generator rather than a stabilizer. When President Donald Trump narrowed his language to stopping only sanctioned tankers, the intent may have been to lower the temperature, yet with Venezuelan warships now visible on the horizon, the message instead appears inconsistent, leaving room for miscalculation by all sides. This is where perception becomes as powerful as force, because for Caracas, the escorts demonstrate sovereignty and resolve, while for Washington, they test credibility, creating a feedback loop in which each move is interpreted less as regulation and more as provocation. Publicly framed as a counter-narcotics effort, the operation privately centers on oil as leverage for weakening and ultimately ousting Maduro. And this dual framing complicates legitimacy, since actions at sea are being judged simultaneously through legal, political, and strategic lenses. U.S. officials acknowledging awareness of the escorts without a clear response reinforces the sense that the escalation has outrun planning, which in high-tension environments often leads to reactive decisions rather than controlled outcomes. As tankers sail under naval protection, what was once economic pressure now resembles a maritime standoff, and the absence of a defined enforcement mechanism raises the stakes of any encounter, because ambiguity at sea rarely de-escalates situations. The risk of a violent clash increases not because either side explicitly seeks it, but because layered signals, seizures, escorts, and warnings compress decision time, making restraint harder to maintain when authority is contested in real time. Russia's immediate reaction underscores this shift, describing the situation as potentially very dangerous, emphasizing constant high-level contacts with Caracas, and urging restraint across the region, which frames the standoff not as isolated, but as a regional destabilizer. President Vladimir Putin's direct conversation with President Maduro signals political backing without operational commitment, a classic move intended to deter further escalation while avoiding entanglement. Yet it also internationalizes the pressure on Washington, to avoid a fatal mistake. China's position mirrors this pattern, firmly opposing unilateral acts of bullying, defending national sovereignty and dignity, and supporting Venezuela's request for an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council, which adds diplomatic weight without promising direct assistance. The convergence of these reactions marks a turning point, because economic pressure that once operated in relative isolation now triggers coordinated political responses from rival powers, expanding the arena of consequence beyond the Caribbean. Oil tankers stranded off the Venezuelan coast, unwilling to risk seizure, illustrate the immediate impact of uncertainty, where fear alone disrupts flows, even before enforcement is fully defined. Russia's warning of unpredictable consequences for the entire Western Hemisphere reframes the issue from a bilateral dispute into a systemic risk, suggesting that missteps here could ripple far beyond the original objective. This moment, in my opinion, represents a clear loss of equilibrium, where economic tools collide with military symbols, alliances harden, and the next decision at sea carries disproportionate weight, which is why understanding how this point was reached is essential before examining where it may lead, and why I invite viewers to share their perspective as this analysis unfolds. The continuation of this moment hinges on how legitimacy is claimed and contested, because President Nicolas Maduro's response reframes the blockade not as a policy dispute, but as an existential challenge, asserting that Venezuela is acting on its own land and within its legitimate rights, a narrative designed to consolidate internal unity while delegitimizing external pressure. What happened in the public messaging from Caracas is a deliberate elevation of stakes, where economic measures are described as warmongering and colonialist, transforming sanctions and seizures into symbols of historical exploitation, which resonates deeply with a population sensitive to sovereignty and foreign intervention. In my opinion, this rhetoric is not accidental escalation, but strategic insulation, because by framing the situation as a fight for the future of young boys, young girls, families, and national survival, the government narrows domestic space for dissent and broadens tolerance for risk. The claim that the United States views Venezuelan oil, minerals, and even territory as inherently belonging to Washington is meant to crystallize fear into cohesion, portraying any compromise as surrender rather than negotiation. This internal narrative gains traction precisely because it aligns with visible actions at sea, allowing leadership to point to naval escorts as proof that words are backed by force, reinforcing credibility at home even as it raises alarm abroad. The assertion that regime change is being sought to impose a puppet government draws a hard line, rejecting any outcome that includes external oversight. And this absolutism reduces off-ramps by defining victory and defeat in total terms. From a psychological standpoint, such framing creates a self-reinforcing cycle, where backing down becomes synonymous with national humiliation, increasing the likelihood that future decisions prioritize symbolism over de-escalation. At the same time, the emphasis on overwhelming public opposition to military intervention inside the United States is a calculated appeal to American domestic constraints, suggesting that Washington lacks the mandate to escalate beyond pressure. The reference to direct communication with the United Nations Secretary General signals an attempt to internationalize the dispute legally rather than militarily, shifting the battlefield to institutions where time and procedure slow momentum. China's support for an emergency Security Council meeting reinforces this path, offering diplomatic cover that delays unilateral enforcement while keeping global attention fixed on legality rather than force. Yet this institutional route runs parallel to operational realities, because tankers, escorts, and patrols operate on compressed timelines where misinterpretation can override deliberation. The central risk now lies in mismatch, where political leaders speak in absolutes while enforcement bodies remain uncertain, creating space for accidental confrontation driven by unclear rules of engagement. In my opinion, the most dangerous aspect is not intent but momentum, as each side feels compelled to demonstrate resolve to allies and adversaries alike, narrowing flexibility with every public statement. Russia's warning about a fatal mistake reflects awareness that maritime incidents often escalate faster than land-based standoffs, especially when multiple powers project interest without direct coordination. The formation of a regional standoff emerges not from formal alliances, but from parallel positioning, where rival powers close ranks rhetorically while avoiding explicit commitments, leaving smaller actors to absorb the immediate risk. Washington's next move becomes decisive not because it will end the crisis, but because it will define the rules under which future encounters occur, clarifying whether enforcement remains selective or becomes expansive. If restraint prevails, the confrontation may stabilize into managed tension. But if ambiguity persists, each escort and interception becomes a referendum on credibility rather than compliance. The loss of the initial equilibrium is already evident, as economic tools now operate alongside military symbols, diplomatic appeals, and historical grievances, blending into a complex confrontation that resists simple resolution. What this recap ultimately reveals is that the crisis is no longer about oil alone, but about authority, precedent, and who defines acceptable limits in contested spaces, a shift that carries implications far beyond Venezuela. As this situation continues to unfold, the real consequence may be the normalization of high-risk pressure tactics at sea, reshaping how power is exercised and resisted. And that is why the direction it takes next deserves close attention, thoughtful reaction, and ongoing discussion among those following every development.